Welcome back. In our last lecture, we examined the early history of the Carolingian family, and we saw how the Carolingians began as mayors of the palace in Austrasia, one of the kingdoms of the Franks ruled over by the Merovingians. We saw how the Carolingians, however, rose from this position to gain control over other Frankish kingdoms such as Neustria, eventually with one member of the Carolingian family, Pepin the Short, deposing the last Merovingian ruler in Francia and making the Carolingian dynasty the new ruling dynasty of the Franks. Today we're going to examine the most famous Carolingian ruler of them all, Charlemagne. There are many reasons for Charlemagne's fame even today. He was long-lived and had a remarkably long reign. He becomes king of the Franks in 768, and he does not die until 814, so he reigned for well over 40 years. He was remarkably successful in many respects. He expands the boundaries of the Frankish Empire to include territories that not even the Romans themselves had succeeded in subduing, and he creates the Frankish Empire, in a sense, because Charlemagne received, and perhaps himself revived, a title that no Western ruler, no barbarian ruler had dared to use since 476, the title of emperor with all of its claims to overlordship over the whole of the West. Charlemagne receives the title of emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. We have some sense of what Charlemagne was like as a person thanks to a remarkable biography of Charlemagne written by someone who knew him and knew him well. The author of this biography was named Einhard, and Einhard, who was an important scholar in his own right, was also Charlemagne's friend and his confidant. And in the early 830s, Einhard decides to leave a record of Charlemagne and his activities for all posterity. Einhard is in many ways not a trustworthy source of information about Charlemagne because he owed a great deal to Charlemagne personally. He had studied at Charlemagne's court. He had been given cushy ecclesiastical offices by Charlemagne. And in many ways, Einhard's biography of Charlemagne strives to put Charlemagne in the best possible light. And unfortunately for us, Einhard is very cunning and was regarded as very cunning by his contemporaries. Virtually every sentence in his biography is carefully constructed to mislead the reader or to put the best possible spin on events. And Einhard also omits a lot of information that he certainly must have known about Charlemagne, but that might have proven embarrassing to Charlemagne. Einhard also wrote his biography not just to put Charlemagne in the best possible light, but as a commentary on events that were occurring during the 830s after Charlemagne's death and during the reign of Charlemagne's successor, Louis the Pious. And in many ways he constructs an idealized vision of Charlemagne to use as a club with which to beat Louis the Pious, who did not often take the advice of Einhard, much to Einhard's dismay. Despite the fact that Einhard's biography is a very manipulative text, and a very cleverly manipulative text, nonetheless, we have to rely on it for much of what we know about Charlemagne. We know from Einhard's biography that Charlemagne was a physically imposing individual who is very tall, very physically strong, although he also had a very large stomach and a relatively high, thin voice, which is surprising. We know that he liked to dress down, that he preferred to wear Frankish clothing, and that he hated it whenever the Pope tried to put him into fancy Italian clothing for important events and make him look better. Among his hobbies, he loved swimming. And he loved taking baths and bobbing in hot baths. And often he and his entourage and important members of the Carolingian government would spend long hours just bobbing around in the warm baths. He hated singing in public, in part because of his high voice. And instead he would just murmur when everyone else was singing around him. Einhard tells us that Charlemagne was a very devout individual. And in certain respects, this is true. Charlemagne loved listening to monks chant, and he loved listening to liturgical office, and he could spend hours listening to monks pray. But he was rather selective in his religious practices. He hated fasting, for example, and he found it almost impossible to abstain from meat, which was his favorite food. Einhard would appear to exaggerate Charlemagne's intellectual achievements just a tad. He assures us that Charlemagne knew Latin, and knew it very well, and that Charlemagne even knew a little Greek. He tells us that his favorite book was City of God by Augustine, which he had read aloud to him. One wonders, though, about these claims, because Einhard also reveals in a passage that is intended to make us admire Charlemagne's persistence but calls into question his learning, he tells us that Charlemagne could not write his name, that he kept a wax tablet under his pillow with a stylus that you would use to etch letters into the wax tablet, and that every night Charlemagne would practice trying to write his name, Carolus, Carolus, and that after years of practice, he still couldn't do it. Another biographer of Charlemagne, who writes several decades after Charlemagne's death, a monk by the name of Notker, tells a story about Charlemagne and what he used to do when monks were chanting that suggests that Charlemagne's knowledge of Latin was not as great as Einhard suggests. Notker tells us, and there's probably some element of truth in this story, that when Charlemagne was listening to monks chant, he would often interrupt the monk right in the middle of a sentence at a point that made no sense, or in the middle of a word, and tell someone else to start chanting right then and there. And this caused the monks to be extremely versatile at chanting, because you had to start in the middle of a word with no warning whatsoever. But the reason why Charlemagne interrupted people so oddly is perhaps not because he wanted the monks to chant so well, but because he had no idea what they were saying in Latin, and so to him one word sounded like another, and that's the reason for these random and sudden breaks in the monastic liturgy whenever Charlemagne was around. Einhard tells us that Charlemagne was a family man after his own fashion, that he was married many times, and he kept a large number of concubines as well. He was devoted to his children, and his relations with the son who would go on to succeed him, Louis the Pious, were indeed remarkably good by Carolingian standards. But even in matter of family relations, Einhard puts a positive spin on actions that probably had motives different from what Einhard tells us. Charlemagne did not want his daughters to marry, and he traveled around with his daughters, taking his daughters with him wherever he went. And he was even able to look the other way when his daughters became involved in love affairs that everyone knew about. But Charlemagne was willing to say, well, it's just kids being kids. As for why Charlemagne did this, Einhard tells us that, according to Charlemagne, he loved his daughters so much, he could not bear to be parted from them at all. The real reason is probably that Charlemagne kept his daughter single because he was fearful that people who married into the Carolingian family, brothers, his sons-in-law, might well attempt to usurp his place within the Carolingian dynasty in those attempt to maintain Carolingian control over the Franks. When Pepin the Short died in 768, he left behind two legitimate sons. One, the younger, named Charlemagne, and the older son was Charlemagne himself. Naming a child Charlemagne was one of the worst things a Carolingian parent could do, because bad things happened to the various Carlomen of the 8th and 9th centuries. Initially, Charlemagne and Charlemagne were in agreement with one another, at least about one problem, the problem of Grifo. Grifo was an illegitimate child of Pepin the Short who wanted to be included in the partition of the kingdoms of the Franks, as it's divided between Charlemagne and Carloman. Carloman and Charlemagne agreed that Grifo had to go, and so Grifo came to Grifo when the two brothers murdered him. Charlemagne was given the main Frankish territories, the core unit of Austrasia and Neustria. Carloman, as the younger brother, is given the territories that had been conquered by Pepin the Short and Charles Martel before him, or fringe territories such as southern Francia. Relations between Carloman and Charlemagne deteriorated, however, as each coveted the other's kingdom. And Charlemagne caught a lucky break in 771 when Carloman died of natural causes. Carloman was married and had infant sons who should have inherited his kingdom from their deceased father. Carloman's widow and children, however, fled in the dead of winter across the Alps to the Lombards, simply to spite Charlemagne and embarrass him, according to Einhard. Charlemagne thundered into Carloman's territories and assumed kingship of them and dismissed his Lombard wife, perhaps not a coincidence at the time, since the Lombard king is now harboring the children of his dead brother. The upshot is that in 771, Charlemagne becomes king of all the Frankish territories, and without gaining control of all of these territories at a relatively early point in his reign, it's doubtful that he would have been able to go on to do what he in fact did. In the 770s, Charlemagne began striking out against his neighbors in every possible direction, attacking anyone he could get his mailed gloves on. First, Charlemagne takes on the Saxons living east of the Rhine River. The Saxons were very much as the Franks had been a few centuries earlier. They are Germanic barbarians, they are illiterate, they are pagan, they have no urban life or towns to speak of. The Carolingians and even the Merovingians had a long history of raiding among the Saxons for loot and also for slaves who could be brought back to serve in the Frankish kingdoms. But Charlemagne didn't want to raid the Saxons for slaves. He wanted to integrate the Saxons and their territory into the Frankish kingdoms, and he wanted to impose Christianity upon the barbarian Saxons. His wars against the Saxons were long and bloody, and probably the most difficult that Charlemagne had to fight. His first campaign against the Saxons comes in 772. His final campaign does not come until 804, more than 30 years of almost annual campaigning against the Saxons. And in a sense, the Saxons were more difficult than other adversaries precisely because they had no urban life and they were fragmented into hundreds of small tribes that would have to be conquered one by one by one in a very long and tedious process. Charlemagne, upon conquering any group of Saxons, would demand that they undergo baptism, herding them by the hundreds, if not thousands, into a river, for example, and demanding that they dunk themselves and then proclaiming them to have been baptized. His policy is to convert first and to teach later. But the Saxons resisted Christianization with true tenacity. No sooner had the Franks returned home at the end of a season of campaigning than the Saxons would renounce their Christianity, renounce the control of the Carolingians, and force Charlemagne to return the next spring. Charlemagne grew frustrated over time with the obstinacy of the Saxons, and in one infamous incident lost his cool in 782 and had more than 4,000 Saxons executed by hand. In the end, though, the Saxons were going to succumb to Charlemagne and the Carolingians, and later in the Middle Ages, the Saxons, having absorbed Christianity, would do to the pagans living to their east what the Franks had centuries earlier done to the Saxons. In conquering the Saxons, Charlemagne conquered what is today Germany, east of the Rhine River up to the Elbe River, and he was able to impose control over territory that the Romans had never succeeded themselves in controlling. In addition to conquering the region of Germany between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers, Charlemagne also took on the Lombards, although in contrast to his wars against the Saxons, the Lombard wars were very swift and very easy. The Lombards had become very different from the group they'd been when they first entered Italy in the 6th century. They had absorbed the culture that they encountered there. The Lombards are town dwellers. They have a fixed capital for their kingdom at the town of Pavia. They are minting gold coins, something that the Franks themselves were no longer doing. And their relatively high degree of civilization would work against them because capturing the capital at Pavia would lead to the quick collapse of the Lombard kingdom. As for why Charlemagne attacked the Lombards at all in 773, Einhard assures us that it was for the same reason that Pepin the Short had attacked the Lombards back in the 750s. It was to protect papal property. It wasn't because the Lombards had sheltered the wife of Carloman and his children. Certainly, in fact, Einhard makes no mention of their presence in the Lombard kingdom at the time of Charlemagne's invasion in 773. It took only 1 year for Charlemagne to conquer the Lombards. By 774, the war was over, and Charlemagne was able to assume for himself the title of King of the Lombards and add it to his other title of King of the Franks. One wonders what happened to Carloman's wife and children. Presumably they were still there in the Lombard kingdom at the time of this conquest, but Einhard, in a moment of forgetfulness, doesn't mention them at all, and one fears and expects the worst. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom was, in one sense, a great coup for Charlemagne, because he's able to add another royal title to the title of King of the Franks, but it also made his life more complicated in an important respect. The Lombards had taken this territory from the Byzantines. The Byzantines would have liked the territory back. Charlemagne was not about to return the territory to the Byzantines despite their requests and their entreaties, and as a result, the relationship between the Byzantines and the Franks becomes more fraught than ever before. As if attacking Lombard, Italy, and Saxony was not enough, Charlemagne also became involved in affairs in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. Here, Charlemagne was more opportunistic. He received ambassadors sent to him in 777 from a town known as Zaragoza. And the local rulers of Zaragoza were having trouble with the rulers of Al-Andalus, who came from a dynasty known as the Umayyad dynasty. More about them in a future lecture. They asked Charlemagne for his help in resisting the Umayyad rulers and promised him all sorts of rewards if he would bring the Frankish army to Spain and help to defend Zaragoza against the Umayyads. And so Charlemagne decided here was an opportunity for him to make inroads into Spain, and he leads the Frankish army across the Pyrenees Mountains into northeastern Spain in 778. This first venture by the Carolingians into Spanish politics was a disaster and Charlemagne's greatest setback. When he gets to Zaragoza, the local rulers had changed their mind about their agreement and would not allow Charlemagne into the town, saying, well, we don't really need your help anymore, you should just return. And Charlemagne has to try and slip back into Francia, but he gets caught in the Pyrenees Mountains returning. Caught not by Arabs or Berbers, but by Christian Basques in northern Spain who ambush the rearguard of the Frankish army as it's passing through the pass at Roncesvalles. The battle at Roncesvalles, or what the French would call Roncesvalles, in 778, was a severe defeat for the Franks. The rearguard is massacred, and it would have been small consolation to Charlemagne to know that eventually the defeat at Roncesvalles would be turned into a victory in a poem called The Song of Roland, who was a Carolingian official who died at this battle. Despite the humiliation that Charlemagne suffers in 778 in Spain, he did not give up on his intentions of trying to make territorial gains at the expense of the Muslims of Spain. And in 801, his son, Louis the Pious, captures Barcelona. This list of Charlemagne's wars that I've just given you against the Saxons and the Lombards and against the Muslims of Al-Andalus hardly exhausts the lists of Charlemagne's enemies, but it does give some sense of his tremendous energy, the fact that he would campaign year after year all over Europe. So impressive was Charlemagne that he's crowned as emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800 by the Pope. But there's a great deal of controversy surrounding this imperial coronation. As always, you turn first to Einhard to try and get some sense of what was going on. And Einhard tells us that Charlemagne did not know he was going to be crowned emperor that day. That when he stepped into church for Christmas Day Mass, he had no idea of what was to come. It was the Pope's idea, who surprised Charlemagne by popping a crown on his head. And then everyone in attendance miraculously broke into imperial acclamations spoken in perfect unison with no rehearsal whatsoever. One wonders about the truthfulness of this account, although it's probably not a total fabrication either. It's doubtful that Charlemagne walked into church on Christmas Day 800 with no idea that the Pope was about to crown him as emperor. Charlemagne had a keen interest in the Byzantine Empire, even though he disliked the Byzantines. And he often tried to emulate the Byzantines in order to raise himself to the same level as them. For example, if you go to Aachen today in Germany, you will see Charlemagne's main palace. And it was constructed after a Byzantine model. It looks very much like a Byzantine imperial palace. It's built in the round, for example. And it's quite likely that Charlemagne wanted to be crowned emperor in part because of his envy of the Byzantine emperors, that this, like the building of the palace at Aachen, was merely another attempt to ape the Byzantines. On the other hand, although Charlemagne was probably in on what was going to go down that day, it's probably true that the real driving force for the imperial coronation was not Charlemagne himself, but it was the Pope, a Pope named Leo III, who was Pope from 795 to 817. And oddly enough, even though the imperial coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day in 800 is going to exercise a powerful influence on the European imagination for more than 1,000 years, Napoleon imitates this coronation in the early 19th century. The reasons why Leo III wanted to crown Charlemagne as emperor were almost trivial and were tied to local politics. The position of Pope was coveted by the leading families of Rome, and these families would vie with one another to get their members elected as Pope. When Leo III is chosen Pope in 795, relatives of the previous Pope, whose name was Hadrian, were upset. They had hoped that another member of their family would be chosen, and they look for ways to get rid of Leo III. They accuse him with the time-honored practices of claiming that he was a fornicator and a perjurer, which have worked rather recently even in our own history. And when charges of fornication and perjury were not sufficient to get Leo III removed from office, they attempted to kidnap him. They locked him in a monastery, attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue, although apparently they botched the job since he was able to speak and see later. Leo III escaped from prison, from this monastery, and fled to Charlemagne's court, and there pled his case, claiming that Charlemagne had to come to Rome and defend him. The charges were probably true, that Leo III was a fornicator and a perjurer and had lied under oath about his activities. But Charlemagne decided that he had to stand by Pope Leo III because Carolingian authority was very closely tied to papal authority. The deposing of the last Merovingian king of the Franks had been done on papal orders, and if the papacy were to be discredited in any way, there might be a ripple effect that would affect the Carolingians and their own control. Therefore, Charlemagne decided that he was going to stand by Leo III. He travels to Rome, claiming that he's going to investigate these charges himself. He establishes a commission to look into the accusations, and the commission gathers evidence, examines witnesses, and reports back to Charlemagne that you don't really want us to rule on this matter, I don't think. We don't have jurisdiction. Here's the evidence. Do with it what you'd like. We're all resigning. Oh, okay. Well, thanks for the evidence, which is later disposed of. The commissioners save themselves by not ruling. Charlemagne claims that, well, since the commission won't tell us what's going on here, I'm going to allow the Pope to clear himself with an oath. If he will swear that he's innocent of these charges, well, then we're all going to accept this oath. And Leo III swears to his innocence on the 23rd of December, 800, 2 days before the imperial coronation of Charlemagne. There's almost certainly some connection between the fact that Charlemagne gets Leo III off the hook on the 23rd of December and Leo III crowns Charlemagne as emperor on Christmas Day. It's not clear what the precise connection is, unfortunately. Perhaps this is Leo III's way of thanking Charlemagne for having done this. Perhaps this is Leo III's way of trying to establish some control over Charlemagne. He is now utterly dependent on Charlemagne and Charlemagne's support for remaining pope, but by crowning Charlemagne as emperor, he is in a sense placing himself in a position of superiority vis-a-vis Charlemagne. Whatever Leo III was thinking, he crowned Charlemagne as emperor, and it seems likely that before 799 and before the attacks on Leo III, Charlemagne probably never entertained the possibility that he would accept the title of emperor or that anyone would want to crown him with this title. Becoming emperor conferred enormous prestige upon Charlemagne, but all it conferred was prestige because no actual power or territory goes along with the title. It's just a snazzy title that Roman emperors had once had. And in some ways, the imperial coronation of Charlemagne was going to cause him and the Carolingian dynasty serious problems in the future. One problem was the implication, an implication that seems not to have been lost on Charlemagne or the Carolingians, that the Pope was now in some sense superior to the Carolingians. Since the Pope had crowned Charlemagne as emperor, well, perhaps popes would in the future decide not to crown Carolingians as emperor, or they would withhold the imperial coronation in return for concessions. The Carolingians appear somewhat vulnerable to the papacy. Real conflicts between popes and would-be emperors over the issue of imperial coronation do not occur until the 11th century or much later. But there are signs already during Charlemagne's lifetime that he knows that he's now in a somewhat more vulnerable position. In 806, Charlemagne declared a final will and testament and made arrangements for the division of his territories among his living sons. Under the terms of the arrangement of 806, none of the sons was to get the imperial title. They are all going to be kings. They're all going to get individual kingdoms, but the imperial title is going to die with Charlemagne. And in that sense, he regards it at this point in time as sort of a personal honorific rather than as a political office that should exist, whether or not Charlemagne himself exists. However, by the time that Charlemagne died in 814, all of his sons had died except for one, Louis the Pious. And since he was left with only one son, he changed his mind about the imperial title and decided that Louis the Pious should get it. In 813, Louis the Pious is crowned as emperor, but in a manner unlike that of Charlemagne himself. In 813, Charlemagne crowns Louis the Pious as emperor and tries to wrest away the right of crowning someone as emperor from the papacy and reserve it for the Carolingians themselves. However, it was not clear that Charlemagne had the right to do this. And so after Charlemagne's death, specifically in 816, Louis the Pious undergoes another coronation, this time by the Pope. And from 816 onwards, there's no question of who has the right to crown someone as emperor. It's going to be the Pope. As Charlemagne got older, he slowed down. He was not able to campaign against his enemies year after year the way he had been able to do as a young man. And he also suffered increasingly from physical illnesses and probably from gout. And as a result, he begins to spend more and more time in his favorite palace at Aachen. The fact that Charlemagne is growing older is rather bad for Frankish power because after 804, there are no more major conquests carried out by Charlemagne, and the Frankish territory is no longer expanding. Charlemagne gets bogged down in a war against the Byzantines early in the 9th century, who are still miffed at the fact that he is not only failed to return the territory conquered by the Lombards, but are even more angry now that he has taken the imperial title, which they would like to reserve for themselves. And the wars against the Byzantines in southern Italy between 803 and 812 really come to no definitive conclusion, certainly not a Carolingian victory. There's an even more ominous development. Already by the final decade of Charlemagne's life, outsiders are beginning to attack the Carolingian Empire. The Vikings have begun their raids. And even though Charlemagne's reign is later remembered as a golden age for the Carolingian dynasty, you could already see ominous storm clouds on the horizon before his death. Charlemagne is famous because he assumed the imperial title, and he is famous because he extended the boundaries of the Frankish Empire as far as they would ever get. But he's famous for other reasons as well. Despite the fact that he can't write his own name, despite the fact that he probably doesn't understand Latin, he had a genuine interest in religion and in scholarship, and he became an important supporter of ecclesiastical reform and of scholarship. And so in our next two lectures, we're going to turn from the history of the Frankish Empire and the Carolingian dynasty to the religious and the intellectual life of Carolingian Europe.